Hey, it's Yay for Yarn, and today I'm going to show you how to knit a scarf for beginners. So this scarf is basically the absolute easiest project you can possibly make. All you need to know how to do is cast on, make a knit stitch, and bind off. And we will be going over those techniques in this video, so if you're not real comfortable with those techniques yet, then this project can help you become more proficient at basic knitting techniques. So this is a great first project ever for any beginner knitter, and this pattern is kind of both a pattern and a formula. So a pattern gives exact, precise instructions for every single step of a project, whereas a formula is kind of a guidelines or an approximate set of instructions that you can adapt and tweak to fit what you're going for. So this video and tutorial and pattern includes both a pattern and kind of a formula where you can change it up, change the size of your scarf, change your needle size, your yarn size, and everything like that to make any kind of scarf you want. So I am going to be giving precise instructions because there is a pattern included with this video, which you can access by visiting the link in the description box down below. That's the first link in the description box. But you can also change up many of the elements of this pattern to make the scarf adapted to what you want to make. So once you have opened the link down below that will show you the free version of the pattern, then of course you're going to need your supplies. So first up, of course, is the yarn. Now for the pattern, we are using number 5 bulky weight yarn. And we're using this mainly because it is a good thickness for beginners, because it is kind of medium weight but a little bit thicker than medium weight. So number 5 bulky weight is a term that refers to how thick your yarn is and not how much the ball of yarn weighs. Both of those measurements are given on your yarn label because skeins of yarn are also measured by how much yarn is included by weight, but the weight of a yarn is actually a term that refers to the thickness. So if you're not familiar with the standard yarn weight system, I will put a link to my video on that down below in the description box. But when you go to choose a yarn for this project, you're going to need to choose a yarn that says number 5 bulky on the label. And you're going to need to make sure that you have at least the minimum number of yards of yarn listed in the pattern instructions. Now you can adjust the length or the width of your scarf and use more or less yarn. You can tweak that as much as you like, but to get a scarf exactly the same dimensions as the one in the pattern, then you're going to need to have at least the minimum number of yards of yarn listed in the pattern. Now, if you are adapting this pattern and using the kind of formula version to use whatever yarn you want and whatever needle size you want, I typically recommend for a decent sized scarf buying at least 200 grams of yarn. And although there are multitudes of multicolored yarns out there that are absolutely beautiful, if you are just getting started with knitting, I highly recommend using a solid colored yarn. And that is because it is much easier for a beginner to see and identify your stitches if your yarn is solid colored. Multicolored yarns are gorgeous, but they often make it more difficult to see your stitches, especially if you're not familiar with the structure of the knitted fabric yet. So once you have become more familiar with knitting and how knitting works and being able to identify your stitches in the fabric, then you can choose whatever color yarn you want. But if this is your first project, your first scarf ever, then you'll definitely want to use a solid colored yarn. And one more thing about the yarn is that you want to make sure that your yarn is a consistent thickness. Okay, so there are some yarns out there on the market that are typically classified as novelty yarns that change in thickness. They're also called thick and thin yarns. And that is where that they are spun to kind of have thicker sections and thinner sections. And that gives kind of a more hand-spun look, and it gives a lot of texture to the finished project. But if you're new to knitting and you're not super familiar with your stitches and identifying them in the fabric yet, that can make it a lot harder to see your stitches. So your yarn needs to be a smooth, consistent thickness, and it needs to be a solid color until you are more familiar with knitting in general. So this particular yarn that I am using here is actually a discontinued yarn from Knit Crate, and it doesn't really matter what brand you are using as long as it is soft, smooth, and solid colored. And the main thing about soft yarns is that it needs to be something that you feel comfortable wearing against the skin, because a scarf is typically worn against the skin. So what you can do to test if a yarn is soft enough for a scarf is to just take the skein of yarn and rub it on the inside of your neck to see if it feels prickly at all or if it has any kind of irritating feeling to it. Now, one common misconception about wool yarn in particular, this is a wool yarn right here, is that a lot of people think they are allergic to wool because it feels prickly or scratchy to them. That's not exactly an allergy. It is possible to have a wool allergy, but a wool allergy typically includes symptoms that are similar to a dog or cat allergy. So just because it feels itchy does not mean that you are allergic to wool. That can often just mean that you have sensitive skin, and that is actually fairly common. So if regular wool that you happen to run across when you do that rub it against your neck test, if it feels prickly or scratchy to you, then chances are you are feeling and holding a lower quality wool that has more coarse fibers in it, and those coarse fibers can feel prickly to sensitive skin. So if you want to use wool, because wool has a lot of really nice properties, then go for a higher quality wool or a superwash wool. A finer fiber wool will produce a knitted fabric that is much softer and does not have that prickly quality to it. So just keep that in mind when choosing a yarn. Make sure that it feels soft against the skin and that it is comfortable to wear up against your neck. Now, this particular yarn that I am using here came pre-twisted in a hank, not in this center pole cake. So I have already wound it up for use to be able to knit from it, whereas one of those twisted hanks is not ready to knit from. Now, if you're not familiar with that, I have a video on how to wind yarn from a hank into a center pole cake like this using a yarn winder in Swift, and I will link that tutorial down below. All right, so now that we've got our yarn picked out, here are the other things you're going to need for this project. So, of course, you're going to need a measuring tape to measure your scarf. You're going to need a yarn needle or a blunt tapestry needle. And this is for weaving in your yarn tails. And of course, the size of your tapestry needle or yarn needle will depend on how thick your yarn is. So if you're using a very thin yarn, then you can go for a needle like this with a very small eye. If you're using a very, very bulky yarn, then a larger eyed needle will be needed. But you'll just need a yarn needle or blunt tapestry needle that will hold a strand of your yarn running through it in the eye of the needle. And of course, you'll need a pair of scissors to trim your tails. So the main tool that we're going to be using for this is a pair of knitting needles. Now, I have here a pair of straight knitting needles, and these are the Knit Picks Caspian straight needles. These are a laminated birch with multiple colors striped into that wood, and these are some of my favorite straight knitting needles that I've ever purchased and used. I love these. I will definitely link these down below as well. But these are the Knit Picks Caspian laminated birch straight needles, and they are very, very smooth. Now, you can use whatever straight needles you have as long as they are a good size for the yarn that you're using. So I am using a size 10.5 or 6.5 millimeter needle. And this is a pretty good size for a number 5 bulky weight yarn. Now, a lot of times yarn labels will recommend a needle size. Keep in mind that is a recommendation, and I typically suggest using one needle size larger than what the label recommends if you're making a scarf, and 2 needle sizes larger than what the label recommends if you're making a scarf and you happen to be a tight knitter. So if you are following the pattern and not the formula version of this tutorial, then you'll definitely want to use the size needle that gives you the correct gauge. Now, if you're not familiar with gauge, I will link my video on that down below as well. Gauge is the measurement of your stitches. So to determine your gauge, what you're going to do is knit a square according to the instructions that we're going to be using for the scarf in just a minute. But you're going to knit a square and then measure how many stitches fit within a certain measurement, and that is your gauge. So if you are following the pattern, which is the exact instructions for the exact scarf that I'm making, then you'll need to check your gauge before beginning your project, because you may need to go up or down a needle size to adjust your gauge so that your scarf will come out to the correct finished dimensions. And I should also mention here that I have straight needles in this project, but you can use a circular needle if you have a circular needle in the correct size that you need to get your gauge correct for the pattern, or the correct size you need for the yarn you're using. All right, so we have all of our supplies ready to go, and we can now get started with the knitting. All right, so I am starting with the center pole end of my cake of yarn here. And what we're going to do is we're going to start by casting on. So I'm going to be using a long tail cast on for this project, and that means we're going to start by leaving a long tail. So normally you need at least a 6-inch tail to start with, but because we're using a long tail cast on, we're going to leave an additional 2 feet or so of yarn before making our slip knot. And if you're not familiar with a slip knot, here's how we make one, okay? We're going to take our piece of yarn and make a loop, like so, okay? So this strand of yarn that is running across the top, the one that's on top, we're going to take the strand that's on the bottom and put our fingers up through that loop. So this strand right here is running across the top of our little X here. So now that I have my fingers coming up through that loop, I can grab the other strand of yarn that was not on top and then pull it up through the loop. And once you tighten that, that loop is adjustable in size. So we're going to take that loop and place it on our knitting needle, like so, and adjust it to fit the needle. So this yarn here is my yarn tail, and this yarn is the yarn that's coming from the skein. So now we're going to talk about, briefly, how you hold the yarn in your hands. So to make a long tail cast on, we want our skein yarn, our working yarn, to be going to the back and our tail yarn to be coming to the front. And what we're going to do is we're going to take our index finger and thumb of the left hand and place it between the 2 strands of yarn and then open our fingers up like this. So we have our working yarn going over the top of our index finger and our tail yarn going over the top of our thumb. And then we're going to take these last fingers of our left hand and sweep them down and grab both strands of yarn like so. So I have both strands of yarn being held by those last 3 fingers of my left hand. So that slip knot counts as our first stitch, and that means our next stitch is going to be made with the long tail cast on. So, of course, if you have a different cast on technique that you have already learned, feel free to use that technique instead of the long tail cast on. Use whatever type of cast on you are comfortable with if you have already learned how to cast on. So what I'm going to do to make that long tail cast on is I'm going to bring my needle tip down and pick up the strand of yarn that is in front of my thumb, and I am inserting from an upwards direction to pick up the yarn that is in front of my thumb. Now I'm going to take that needle tip, reach behind and grab the yarn that is coming off of my index finger, and then pull that yarn from the index finger under the yarn that was in or over my thumb. So this is what that looks like at this point. Now I'm going to pull my thumb out of that loop and then insert it back under the yarn like so, so that now my thumb has pulled that loop not tight, but just snug against the needle. So again, I've brought my thumb out towards me, and I have that yarn going around my thumb like so. And to cast on another stitch, I can bring my needle tip down towards me, pick up the yarn that's on the front of my thumb, reach back and grab the yarn from the index finger and pull it through the loop that is on my thumb. Now I can let go of the loop with my thumb, and then when I insert my thumb back under that strand of yarn, it will snug the loop against the needle. So one more time, I'm going to bring my needle tip towards me, pick up the strand of yarn that is on the front of my thumb, reach up and grab the strand of yarn that's on my index finger, and pull it through the loop that my thumb is making. Then I can let go of the loop with my thumb and then pick up that strand of yarn again with my thumb. So that is how we cast on with the long tail cast on method. Like I said, feel free to use a different cast on technique if you like. All right, so now that you know how to cast on, you're going to continue casting on until your scarf is the width that you want. Now for the pattern, if you're using the pattern version with the specific instructions, then we're going to be casting on a total of 32 stitches. So every one of these loops on your needle is one stitch, okay? So continue casting on until you have the length that you want on your cast on. However, keep in mind that many times the cast on, when it's sitting on the needle, will appear shorter in length than once you have knit some fabric off of that, and you can see how wide your piece really is, because the width of the cast on is not an exact representation of the width of your finished piece. So you can only get an exact width of your finished piece after you've knit for a couple inches, and you can see how wide your piece is when you have spread it out and you actually have some fabric on there. So if you're just following the formula version and you are making up your own number of stitches for the scarf that you want to make, then I would recommend casting on until your cast on is a little bit narrower than what you want your finished scarf to be. Because once you knit a few inches off of that cast on, then the finished piece will lay wider as a finished fabric than the cast on edge when it's on the needle will look. Alright, so I have my total number of stitches cast on. All of my stitches are sitting on the needle here, and now we're ready to start actually knitting. So when we knit, we hold the needle that is totally full of stitches in the left hand. I like to scoot the stitches close together, not all the way to the needle tip, but kind of close together, so that you can kind of see all of your stitches can sit within your hand that you're holding this needle with, so that it's easier to work them off with your other hand. So the full needle goes in your left hand, and the empty needle goes in your right hand. Now there are two general ways to hold the yarn. So some people prefer to hold the yarn in their right hand, and that is typically called English style knitting, while other people, myself included, prefer to hold the yarn in the left hand, and that is typically called continental style knitting. There are other variations as well, and there are variations within those two major categories. But point being, if you've never really knit before and you have not really gotten comfortable with knitting, you're not sure which hand you like to use better, then you'll want to probably try it with both hands and see which feels more comfortable for you. So when I knit, I use my ergonomic speed knitting method, which is a variation of the continental style, and I hold my yarn in the left hand like so, and I will show a little bit more of that in just a minute. But I will also be showing how to hold the yarn in the right hand as well, even though that is kind of awkward for me because that's not my preferred method, but you can choose to do it either way. So if we look at what is sitting on our left needle right now, we have these loops sitting on the needle, okay? I'm going to go ahead and for these first few stitches hold the yarn in my right hand, and I'm going to let the yarn feed over and under my fingers, but you want to make sure that however you hold the yarn is coming over the top of your index finger. And by the way, we are working with the yarn that is coming from the skein and not the yarn that is coming from the tail, because this tail yarn is actually not what we're going to be knitting with. We're only knitting with the yarn coming from the skein. So regardless of how you hold your yarn, when we work a knit stitch, which is the only stitch we're going to be using for this scarf, when we work a knit stitch, we always insert the right needle into the stitch from front to back. We are inserting under. You see this strand of yarn that is on the front of the left needle? That's the front of our loop. We're inserting under the front of that loop, except we want our right needle to go from front to back so that it is sitting behind that left needle. So when we insert our needle into the stitch, we're inserting it from front to back under the front of the next loop on the left needle, but we want our right needle to go behind the left needle and make this X. So that is the first step of a knit stitch. The second step is to get the yarn wrapped around the right needle tip in a counterclockwise direction. So the next step to make a knit stitch is to get the yarn wrapped around the right needle tip in a counterclockwise direction. So we're only wrapping the yarn around the right needle tip, the one I'm holding in my right hand, even though it is currently pointing to the left. And we want it wrapped around that needle tip in a counterclockwise direction. So I'm going to take the working yarn that is in my right hand at the moment, bring it behind the right needle, and then in between so that it's just coming in front of the right needle and not the left needle. So now it is going around counterclockwise. And the third step to make a knit stitch is to bring that yarn that we just wrapped around the needle, we're going to bring it through the stitch that's on the left needle. So I'm going to use the pointy part of the needle to slide that new strand of yarn through the old stitch. And if we kind of pull it away, you can see how the old stitch on the needle is a little bit stretched at the moment, but that the new loop of yarn on my right needle has been pulled through that old stitch. So now the final step in the knit stitch is to let the old stitch fall off of the left needle. So let's do that again with the English style. So I'm going to again insert my right needle from front to back into the front of that loop of yarn on my left needle, and the right needle should now be going behind the left needle tip in an X. And then I'm going to get that yarn wrapped around the right needle tip only in a counterclockwise direction. So again, I'm going to go behind the needle tip, and there are many ways to do this. Some people just pick the yarn up and bring it around and then hold it, while others who are typically more experienced and have more practice with English style can just reach it around without letting go of the needle. But regardless, once you get that yarn wrapped around your needle tip, you're going to pull the yarn that you just wrapped around through the old stitch on the left needle and then lift the old stitch off of the left needle. And we've made another new stitch on our right needle. So again, I'm going to insert my right needle from front to back into the first stitch or the next stitch that is on the left needle tip. And that right needle is making an X, and going behind the left needle, I can now get the yarn wrapped counterclockwise around the right needle only, pull that yarn through the old stitch, and lift the old stitch off. So one more time, let's do that again English style. We're going to insert the right needle from front to back into that first stitch that is now the next stitch on the left needle, wrap the yarn around counterclockwise, and then pull it through and lift the old stitch off. Now, like I said, that's not my preferred method, so I'm going to go ahead and switch to my preferred method, which is a variation of the continental style. I like to weave the yarn over and under my fingers like so, until the yarn is coming over the top of my left index finger. And then I like to grasp the needle in my left hand like so, very gentle, and I like to hold my left index finger behind the left needle tip about 1 inch away. So with continental style, the basic steps of the knit stitch are the same because we are still inserting the stitch, getting the yarn wrapped around the needle, and then pulling it through and lifting the old stitch off. So I'm going to take that right needle tip, insert it into the front of the stitch, and when I say the front of the stitch, I should clarify, to insert into the back of the stitch would be to go at it this way. If you see there's a front and a back of this loop, if we insert into the back, that goes like this. We don't want to do that because that will twist our stitch. Now, sometimes knitting through the back of a stitch is used on purpose for a specific reason, but generally we are always going to be knitting into the front of a stitch unless the instructions tell you otherwise. So here is the front of the stitch. It is the strand of yarn or the part of the loop on the left needle that is on the front of the left needle. But I want my right needle going behind the left needle tip, like so that it makes an X. Then I want to get the yarn wrapped around my right needle tip in a counterclockwise direction, like so that then I can pull it through the old loop on the left needle and lift the old loop off. So again, I'm going to insert my right needle from front to back into the front of the next loop on my left needle, get the yarn around the needle tip in a counterclockwise direction, and then pull that strand of yarn through the old loop and lift the old loop off. And one more time, we will insert that right needle from front to back into the next stitch, get the yarn wrapped around the needle tip counterclockwise, pull the new yarn through, and lift the old stitch off. So we are essentially going into each stitch and pulling a new loop of yarn through the old loop that was already there. So however you choose to work your knit stitch, you'll want to knit every stitch across the row until you have used up all the stitches that are on the left needle, and then all of your stitches will be now situated on the right needle. Alright, so I'm down to the end of my row here. I've got 1 stitch left on the left needle, and then I have worked it off of the left needle. I now have all 32 stitches situated on the right needle. So now we do something called turning the work, which basically just means we're going to take the empty needle in the right hand and turn our piece over so that the right needle, that was the right needle, that is now full of stitches, goes in the left hand. And again, we like to kind of scrunch the stitches towards the tip, but not so much that they're going to fall off on their own. So again, we're going to knit each stitch all the way across the row. Alright, so I made it to the end of the next row. And what we're going to be doing is just knitting back and forth across the row again and again and again until we begin to build the length of our knitted scarf. So I'm going to continue knitting each stitch across every row until the scarf reaches the desired finished length, and you can do the same, just continue knitting back and forth across your row until your scarf is the length that you want it to be, and then I'll show you how to finish it off. Alright, so I have knit a pretty decent length on my scarf here, and what I need to do now is, because I'm almost out of yarn in the skein that I had started with, I need to add another skein of yarn to keep going. So I wanted to show you what I think is one of the easiest possible techniques you can use to add a skein of yarn to your project without having to weave in any yarn tails at all. This technique does not work for everything. I think it is primarily the most useful when you're working with garter stitch, because it will blend in the best with garter stitch. If you try to do this with stockinette or another stitch pattern, it will be a little bit more obvious in the fabric, but because garter stitch has a lot of texture to it, this will blend in most of the way where you don't really notice it at all when the scarf is being worn. So what we've been doing in our scarf is just knitting across every single row. And as we knit across every row, we are working with this single strand of yarn that is coming from what was our skein. It is now almost used up, but we have the working yarn coming through my hand here as I'm knitting across, and it is only a single strand of yarn. So if you are working with a garter stitch project like this, where there's not a whole lot of complexity involved, it's just garter stitch, and you want to add a new skein of yarn, the trick that I'm about to show you is what I think is the easiest way to do so. Alright, so I have finished a row and I'm ready to turn and work the next row of plain old knit stitches. So once I turn that work, I want to make sure that I have at least the amount of yarn needed for another row. And I might actually have the amount of yarn left for 2 more rows in the length that's left of my first skein. So I'm going to go ahead and knit another row real quick, because what we want to do is we want to start joining that new ball of yarn when we have at least enough length of yarn left in our first skein to work 1 more row. And if you are working with a larger project than a scarf, then you don't have to work this join across the entire row. You can do it across part of a row instead if you like. But since my scarf is only about 9 inches wide approximately, then I like to work this all the way across the row. Alright, so I've worked until I have enough yarn left for 1 more row plus a little bit extra. And here's how we're going to join the yarn, all right? So as we have been working here, we've had our working yarn, which is the old yarn tail that we have left from the first skein, and we've had it coming through the hand. Of course, if you have been using the English style and you have the yarn in your other hand, that's okay too. But however you like to hold the yarn, this is how we've been working with it, where we have a single strand of yarn that is coming from the skein that we are knitting from. So to add the next skein, we need to find the end. This is the outside tail. This was wound on a yarn winder, but if you're using a different type of skein, then you may also have a center pull end. So if your skein is kind of oval shaped, then the center pull end will still be in the middle. So you may have to kind of wiggle your fingers around in there to find it. You may end up pulling out a small wad of yarn while you're at it, and that's okay. But the point here is that we want to find the end that is inside that skein of yarn. So here is our new skein of yarn. Here's my knitting needle with all the stitches on it. Here's my old length of yarn that's left from the first skein. So I'm going to pick up that old length of yarn from the first skein as if I'm going to continue knitting across with it, which I kind of am. And then I'm going to take the new yarn, leave a tail. It doesn't have to be a super long tail, but I'm going to leave a tail of that yarn sticking out at the edge of my piece. And then I'm going to take the current yarn that is from the old skein and the yarn from the new skein and hold them together as though they were one strand. So we're going to pretend that these 2 strands together are 1 strand of yarn and run them through our hand however you like to tension your yarn as though they were 1 strand. So as I begin to work across this row, we're going to be knitting with both strands of yarn at the same time. That's not any more difficult than knitting with a single strand. You just have to make sure that you are seeing both strands of yarn wrap around the needle. So I like to hold the tail from the new skein in my other hand like so, just to keep it a little bit taut. Then when I insert into that first stitch, I want to make sure that with every stitch, both of those strands are getting wrapped around my needle with each knit stitch that we work. So we are essentially pretending that these 2 strands of yarn are 1, and in the finished fabric, this row will just look a little bit thicker than some of the other ridges in the garter stitch. But as we knit across here, we are both finishing off with the old skein and working the new one in while joining them in a way that does not require weaving in any tails. All right, so here is the tail from my old skein, and it actually didn't quite make it all the way across the row, but we can work it through until we've got at least 1 inch left hanging out. So there's my little tail. I'm going to go ahead and drop the tail because it ran out. Although if you had enough, you could carry it all the way across to the edge. Then I'm going to finish out my row with this single strand of the new skein. So we have now, here's our tail from the new skein that we have started with. We've worked it into that row all the way across, and it is now our working yarn. So I'm going to go ahead and knit a few more rows after this to kind of show you what that join looks like in the fabric. And this is not something that everyone will want to use for every project because you can see it a little bit, but this is especially good for projects where that both sides will be visible, both sides of the fabric, such as this scarf, and you don't want any super obvious yarn changes in your piece. Now, if you can see right there, this is the first stitch that had that yarn tail in it, the little short tail, and it did kind of stretch out. So we'll want to just give that yarn tail just a little bit of a tug to snug it back up. And we want to keep it out of the way as we're knitting because we're not picking it up again. We're just knitting. And as we work into these stitches that were made with 2 strands of yarn, you can still see how they are separate stitches, but each is made with 2 strands of yarn. So when we do that, we want to work into both strands of each stitch because that stitch is made with 2 strands of yarn. The yarn is doubled. So like I said, I'm going to knit a couple more rows so you can see what this join looks like in the fabric. Alright, so I have worked a few more rows, and let's just lay this piece out flat here so you can see the fabric. And if you look very carefully, you can just barely see that this ridge right here is a bit thicker than the others. But this method of adding a new skein of yarn really blends in pretty well with a garter stitch fabric like this. So this right here is the ridge that is thicker because it was knit with 2 strands. So let's look at it on the other side. And again, we can still see a slightly thicker ridge here, but it is blending in fairly well where that you don't really notice it. For example, if you were wearing this scarf, nobody would really be able to see, oh look, they joined a skein of yarn here, that row is thicker. Well, it's because it blends in so well with the texture of the garter stitch, and it just adds a little bit of a thicker ridge in that garter stitch texture. So to finish this off, to finish off our join, all we have to do now is trim these little yarn tails. Now, if you want to make sure they're very, very extra secure, then you can, if you want to, take a yarn needle with what's left of your tails. And if you want to just add an extra layer of security to that yarn tail, you can thread it through your yarn needle. And then at the edge of the fabric here, just make a very small knot with your yarn tail. And then if you want to, you can weave in the additional length of tail. So I might go through here and follow with my yarn needle the path of the yarn in one of these rows that is not doubled, but still close to my ending point where I finished off with this yarn, or joined this yarn, I should say. And you may choose to split the yarn just a little bit. And what you're going to do if you choose this extra secure option is leave a very, very small amount of yarn, about 1/4 inch past where you've woven it in, and trim that yarn tail. And that small 1/4 inch little tail, if you just kind of fluff it a little bit, will spread out, blend in with the fabric, and it will leave just enough of an end where that it will be much less likely to work its way out. But that knot at the edge there that we just made will keep the yarn from ever being able to come undone from the end here. Now, if you want, you can also, because this is technically woven in, you can also just trim it, leaving about a 1/4 inch tail. And again, just kind of fluff the end of the yarn a little bit separate the little fuzz of that yarn end, and it will also blend in nicely with the work. And whether or not you choose to make a knot with your tail is entirely a personal preference thing, because those two yarns having been worked together will not just come undone on their own unless you manually undo and pick apart that woven in section where we knitted those two strands together. So that is the easiest way to add a new skein of yarn when you're working with garter stitch, and it leaves a pretty close to invisible join in the work, where that all you can see is that little bit thicker ridge in the garter stitch. So it blends in very nicely. So now that I've added my second skein of yarn, I can go ahead and continue knitting from it to add the rest of the length to my scarf. Alright, so I have continued knitting my scarf until it is either the length that you're going for, or you'll want to stop when you have a certain amount of yarn left based on whether or not you want to add fringe. So if you're not adding fringe, then you could continue knitting, stopping when you have at least 1 yard of yarn left before you run out. And you'll need that yard of yarn to bind off and have a yarn tail to weave in at the end. If you do want to add fringe, then you'll need not only a yard left for your bind off and your yarn tail if you want to weave that in, but you'll also need to determine how much yarn to leave for your fringe. So here is kind of the formula that I like to use for calculating how much yarn you need for fringe. So when I add fringe to a piece, I like to put a piece of fringe in every stitch across the edge. So I'm going to add fringe to every stitch across the cast on edge and every stitch across the bind off edge, which is going to be at this end. So I have 32 stitches on my needle, which means I have a total of 64 stitches to add fringe to if I add it to both ends. So when we add fringe, each length of yarn gets folded in half before we add it. And I like to cut my lengths of yarn for making fringe about 1 foot long. And by cutting a 12-inch length of yarn for fringe, then when it's folded in half, it makes 6 inches folded in half. Then when you pull it through, make the little knot, and trim all your fringe straight across the bottom, it leaves about 5.5 inches of fringe, which I think is a pretty good length for fringe on a scarf. So I need 1 foot of yarn for each piece of fringe, and I want to add a piece of fringe to every stitch on each end of my scarf. So I have a total of 64 stitches between the current end and the cast on end. And so I need 64 feet of yarn, which is a little over 21 yards. So what I've done here is I have left in my skein, I've measured out approximately 22 yards of yarn, and then an additional yard of yarn for the bind off. And that will help make sure that we not only have enough yarn for fringe, but we also have enough yarn for that bind off, and we don't have to worry about running out as long as we are careful to make sure we have enough before we start to finish off our scarf. So once my fringe is finished, it will be approximately 5.5 inches long, which will add, since we're doing it at both ends, it will add 11 inches to the total length of my scarf. So for an adult size scarf, I recommend making the total length of your scarf at least 55 inches long. Now, if you're making a child size scarf, then you can go with about 45 inches long, and that would be a more appropriate length for a child size scarf. But this is just a scarf. There's nothing really precise about it, as far as it doesn't have to fit somebody perfectly because it's a scarf. So the length is kind of subjective. You can knit it longer if you want. You can make it shorter if you want. So if you want to make this as a cowl or as an infinity scarf, then here's what you'll need to do for that. If you're making a cowl, which is basically a tube of knitting that just goes around the neck one time and the ends are sewn together, for a cowl, then you'll need to make your length of your knitted piece at least 22 inches long. 24 is also a good length for a cowl. But if you want to make it as an infinity scarf, where that the length of the scarf can loop around the neck more than once, then I would recommend making your piece 2 feet or 24 inches long per time that you want it to wrap around the neck. So if you want to make it wrap around the neck twice, then you'll make it 48 inches long. And like I said, this is a scarf and it's not really going to have to fit somebody perfectly. So if you want to make it a little longer or maybe slightly shorter, it will still be okay. But you do want to make sure with an infinity scarf or a cowl that it is big enough that you can comfortably wrap it around the neck or put it over your head or however you're going to wear it. But for a cowl or an infinity scarf, you'll want to make sure that it is long enough so that you can easily put it over your head in the case of a cowl, or easily and comfortably wrap it around the neck however many times you want for an infinity scarf. So this version right here is just going to be a flat scarf, and I'm going to go ahead and stop right here because I have enough yarn left for my fringe, and currently my scarf without being blocked yet is almost 50 inches long. So by the time I add 11 inches of fringe, then it will be 61 inches long, not including any length that we might gain by blocking the fabric, because blocking, which we will get to in a minute, is a way to help relax the fabric. And garter stitch is very elastic and stretchy and squishy. And once we block it, sometimes it will relax just slightly, and that over the length of the scarf can add an inch or two, or sometimes 3, to the length of your finished project. You may not want to count on that couple extra inches as far as assuming that it's going to gain that much length, because that will depend on the yarn you're using and how springy it is. Some yarns are very, very drapey and have they don't have a whole lot of structure to them, and those yarns will not really gain extra length from being blocked as far as the finished piece. But we will get to the blocking step in a minute. My point being that my finished scarf with the fringe on it will be over 60 inches long. And I think 60 inches is a pretty good length for an adult size scarf. So I have my measured out amount of yarn left over, plus a little bit extra. And I'm gonna go ahead and stop knitting here. Now, to stop knitting this piece, we still have all of these loops sitting on our needle. So we need to get these loops both off the needle and secured in such a way that they do not come unraveled, because as this is right now, if you were to just pull the needle out, then it would be very easy to unravel all the stitches on the needle. So instead of leaving it in an unsecure, unfinished way, we're going to do something called binding off, and this is just a way of securing our finished edge so that none of those stitches can come unraveled. So there are many different ways you can bind off. I'm just going to do in this example a very standard bind off. You don't want to do this very tightly, so if you can, try to keep it loose. If you have a hard time keeping it loose, then I have a separate video which I will link down below that explains an extra step you can add to the bind off to help make it looser. So if you want to check that out, I will link it down below, but for this example, I'm going to just do a regular bind off and try to do it loosely. So to bind off, basically what you're going to do is knit the first 2 stitches, like so, and we're going to take the first stitch, which is this one over here, it's the one on the right, and we're going to take our left needle, and we're going to take the tip of that left needle and insert it from left to right through the first stitch that we knit, not the one that the yarn is coming from, but the one before it. So I've inserted my left needle from left to right into that first stitch, and making sure that the second stitch stays on the needle, I'm going to lift this loop of yarn, which is the first stitch, up and over the second stitch and off the tip of the needle. So making sure that my second stitch doesn't fall off, I've lifted the first stitch up over it and off the tip of the needle. Now I can let go with my left needle. So for all the following stitches, we're going to again knit a stitch so that there are now 2 stitches on my needle. Now I can take the left needle tip and insert it from left to right through that first stitch, and then I'm going to lift this stitch up and pass it over the second stitch and the needle tip, making sure that second stitch does not fall off. So you can kind of use the right needle tip to scoop that second stitch through the first stitch that we're passing over it. So again, I'm going to knit a stitch, insert my needle from left to right through the first one, lift it up and pass it over the second stitch and the needle tip so that it falls off the needle completely. So now you can see that we are starting to make a finished edge here where there are no loops coming off the edge. So again, knit a stitch, pass the first stitch over the second one, knit the next stitch, pass the first stitch over the second one, and we're going to continue doing this all the way across until we only have one loop left. Alright, so I am down to the last stitch that I can knit into. I've knit all the stitches off of the left needle, and now I just have to pass the first stitch over that very last one. And that is the end of our bind off. So you can see how that we are down to the last loop on the needle. We have this lovely, straight, clean, finished edge here. And now we could finish off in one of two ways. Regardless, we're going to cut the yarn, leaving a length of yarn left before, like we're not going to cut it up here by the last loop. But we can either pull it through the way that it is or pull it through the current loop. So here's what we're going to do. Because we are adding fringe to this, normally if you were making something without fringe, then you would tie off and weave in your yarn tail, which is this extra piece of yarn that's left, the length of yarn that you leave after you've finished with your piece. But because we are adding fringe to this, we get to cheat and we don't have to weave in any yarn tails. So we're going to just cut the yarn, making sure that our yarn tail is longer than our fringe is going to be. And then that yarn tail can just become part of the fringe and we don't have to worry about weaving in any yarn tails at all, which is super awesome. So we're going to go ahead and trim our yarn tail. And like I said earlier, we are making our fringe to finish at about 5.5 inches long. So I'm going to trim my yarn tail to be more than 5.5 inches long. I've got about 8 inches here that I'm going to leave as part of my yarn tail. So the rest of this yarn here is going to be part of our fringe. This right here, what we're going to do is just, you can either stretch the loop and then pull the yarn tail through the loop, like so, and then tighten it, or you can just stretch the loop until the yarn tail comes out and then tighten it. Either way will work just fine, but we have now finished our bind off edge here, and we can move on to the blocking step. So as I mentioned earlier, blocking is a step that relaxes the fabric and helps it to look and feel and drape its very best. And I highly recommend blocking any project that you make just because it does help make the finished item look and feel better than it does when it just comes off the needles. So there are several different ways that you can block a finished piece of knitting, and the method you choose will typically depend on your fiber content. So I have an entire video on blocking your knitting or crochet projects, and I will link that down below. But typically you would either wet block or steam block a finished project. Now, steam blocking is usually the choice for acrylic or synthetic yarns, and wet blocking is usually the typical choice for animal fiber yarns or other natural fibers. Now, because my yarn that I'm working with here is wool, I'm going to go ahead and wet block my finished piece. And that basically means that I am going to very gently get it all wet, basically press it down into a bowl of water until it is saturated, then gently squeeze out the extra water so that it's not drippy, and then I will lay it out on a set of blocking mats or a bunch of towels that are layered up, and then I will pin it out to the finished measurements, basically pinning the edge of the knitting through the towels or the blocking mats to hold it in place and help it dry with precise straight edges and to the correct measurements that I'm going for. Now, you don't want to stretch your piece as you're blocking it. You just want it to lay however it is naturally going to lay. You can smooth it out, straighten it, finesse it a little bit, but we don't want to stretch our piece as we're blocking it, because once we unpin it, then it will just kind of shrink back to the way it would naturally want to go. So we want to basically just lay it out smooth and flat and pin it down so that it is straight and neat and even, and then allow it to dry completely before unpinning it. And this will help our scarf have better drape. The finished scarf will then lay better and look nicer and more professional. Now, if you want to steam block, if you're using an acrylic, you can technically steam block natural fibers if you want to, but steam block is typically chosen for acrylics because acrylics just do better with steam blocking. So for steam blocking, then you'll want to lay your piece out on an ironing board or several layers of thick towels, and then you will either hover over it with a garment steamer or an iron with the steam turned on, but you do not want to touch the fabric with your iron or steamer. You want to hover it a couple inches above the surface without touching the iron or the steamer to your finished piece. And then, of course, once you're finished steaming the whole thing, then you'll allow it to dry and cool completely. So I'm going to go ahead and block my scarf before moving on to the fringe, and I highly recommend that you do so. It is not absolutely 100% necessary, but it does definitely improve the look and feel of your finished project. So please go block your scarf with whichever method you choose. Like I said, there is a more detailed tutorial, which I will link below, for blocking your projects. And once my finished scarf is blocked and it has dried all the way, then we'll be ready to move on to the fringe. Alright, so my scarf is blocked and I am ready to go ahead and add fringe to this one. And so what I've done here is I have cut, as I mentioned earlier, I have cut lengths of yarn that are 12 inches long. So all I've done is taken a measuring tape, laid it out on the table, a ruler would work fine too, and I have measured out 12-inch lengths of yarn, and I have cut 64 of them so that for each of the 32 stitches, I can put a 12-inch length of yarn in each of the 32 stitches on each end of the scarf. So one thing you do not want to do when you are measuring out lengths of yarn for fringe is you do not want to stretch the yarn taut as you're measuring it. So you don't want to like put the end of the yarn up to 0 and then go like this to measure it out. You want to just lay it flat against your measuring tape or ruler so that you can then get an accurate measurement, because if you stretch it taut then cut it, then it's going to be shorter than 12 inches when you let go, because most yarns do have just a little bit of stretch to them. Alright, so let's add our fringe, and I have before me, this is actually the cast-on end of the scarf, but whichever end you're working with doesn't really matter. You just want the end that you're going to add fringe to be facing you. And what we're going to be doing is, as we add our fringe, we're going to insert the yarn into each stitch of the cast-on edge. And for this task, I am using a crochet hook. The exact size of the crochet hook doesn't really matter in this case because we're not crocheting right now. We are just using the hook to pull something through. So whatever size crochet hook you have, as long as it is big enough to grab the yarn, will work fine. So for each piece of fringe, I'm actually going to start over here at the corner. For each piece of fringe, you're going to take that 12-inch length of yarn and fold it in half so that the ends are matching up. And then we have this little loop where we folded it. So this is the halfway point of our piece of fringe. And then I'm going to come over here to the very corner and I'm going to insert my crochet hook into the corner stitch of my scarf, and I am actually inserting it up from the bottom. So I'm going from bottom to top, and now I'm going to use the crochet hook, grab that folded loop section of our piece of fringe, and we're going to pull it through the edge of the scarf just enough so that we have a little bit of a loop to sit on the crochet hook. And we've pulled it through the edge of the scarf, but we have not pulled it all the way out. So now I'm going to go ahead and take the length of my piece of fringe, wrap it around the hook, and pull those 2 yarn tails of the fringe through the loop that we just made. And then I will go ahead and tug on both tails at the same time to tighten that knot. So that right there is our first piece of fringe. So I've gone ahead and zoomed in here so you can see this closer up as I do the next few pieces. Again, I'm going to take my length of yarn, fold it in half so that the ends match up like so. And when I bring those ends together and smooth out that folded in half piece of yarn, we have this loop here. And that is our halfway point of our piece of fringe. So again, I'm going to come down here to the next stitch on the edge of my piece, and I'm going to insert my hook up from bottom to top through the edge of the next stitch in my scarf end here. And then I can use the crochet hook tip to grab the halfway mark on that piece of yarn, pull it through so that just a small loop of yarn has come through the end of the scarf, slide the hook up so that that loop slides onto the straight part of the hook. Then I can wrap the yarn tails around the crochet hook and pull them through the loop until they come out. And then of course we tug to tighten that knot. So now I have 2 pieces of fringe on the end of my scarf. And I'm going to continue to do that with every stitch across this edge here. So again, I'm going to take the length of yarn, fold it in half, and then when I find that halfway point, I can insert my hook up through the edge of the fabric, grab the halfway point, pull it through till there's just a loop on my crochet hook, and then I can wrap the tails around the crochet hook tip and pull them through that loop all the way through until the ends come out, and then tug to tighten that knot. Alright, so I've got the first few pieces of fringe on there, and I'm going to continue doing that in every stitch till I get to the corner. And since we do have a yarn tail here, I'm going to show you how we include that yarn tail with the last piece of fringe on this corner of the scarf. So I'm going to go ahead and add fringe all the way across the end of my scarf here. Alright, so I have done all of my fringe across to this last stitch right here, where the yarn tail is coming from. You can see this is my corner. And I'm going to put the last piece of fringe into this corner. And we're going to include our yarn tail in it so we don't have to weave the yarn tail in at all. So just like normal, I'm going to insert my hook up through that stitch. I've got my piece of yarn here that has been folded in half. And I'm going to grab it with my hook and pull it through the fabric like so. And instead of what we would normally do where we would wrap the yarn tails around the hook and pull them through, we're going to also grab this yarn tail down here, wrap all 3 of those pieces of yarn around the yarn tail, and pull it through the loop. So now when we pull this tight, our yarn tail has been included in that little knot that holds the fringe on, and we can just trim it to length. Now I've gone ahead and done the fringe as far as tying the fringe on for both ends of my scarf. But before we can really call it finished, of course we have to trim the yarn tail to length. But no matter how precisely you measure your fringe and how careful you are to fold each piece exactly in half, as you can see, even if I straighten this out really nicely, comb it with my fingers until it's very smooth and as close to straight and perfect as it can possibly be, you can still look at this edge and go, these are not all even. And that's pretty much inevitable when you're working with fringe on a project. So, is it so uneven that you couldn't use it like this? Of course not. But if you want to make it straighter, aside from trimming off the extra yarn tail here, if you want to make it straighter, you can go ahead and trim it to straighten it off. Now, I'm going to go ahead and trim this little section right here because this piece of yarn and the yarn tail were significantly longer, probably 3/8 of an inch longer than the rest. So you can totally leave it like this. And in fact, if you do want to trim it straight, I recommend blocking or steaming your fringe before you trim it, because that does help smooth out every last strand of yarn, especially if some of your yarn had some kinks or bends in it from being rolled up and wound into a skein. But you don't have to trim it any more than this. It's just that if you want it to make it a little bit straighter, then you can. Now, here's the thing. When it's this close to being straight, the only thing you can do to get it like perfectly straight, as far as the only technique that I have ever heard of or known of, is to put this on a self-healing cutting mat. If you're a quilter, you probably have one of these, and use a quilting ruler and a rotary cutter to trim off the yarn, the little fuzzy ends of the yarn, to make your fringe perfectly straight. I don't have one of those with me right now, and you don't absolutely have to do that, but that's really the only way that I know of to get it any closer to perfectly straight than just to trim it. But I'm just going to come through here with my little scissors and snip off the little fuzzy ends of just a few of these strands that appear to be a little bit too long compared to the rest. Is it perfect? Not quite, but when you're wearing this, it's going to be so close to being straight that nobody's literally going to come up and measure this to the millimeter to see how long it is. So it does not have to be like perfectly straight. Main thing you want to do is just make sure that it's not crooked and that you don't have any like really long pieces hanging down. And the unevenness, even if you measured all of your strands of fringe perfectly, any unevenness here is primarily going to come from when you pull it tight, because that exact halfway point of each piece of fringe can get shifted just a tiny bit when you pull it tight. But that's just what happens with fringe. So you can go ahead and trim it a little straighter if you want to. You don't have to. It does make it take a little bit longer, and it makes a mess of these little fuzzy bits of yarn, and it only improves the straightness of the finished fringe slightly. So like I said, trimming it straight is technically optional, but it is a step that I like to take most of the time. But steaming your fringe, if your strands are a little wonky or if they're kinked, I would definitely recommend doing that whether you're going to trim them or not. But if your strands are wonky and kinked, then steaming it will help straighten them out and make it much easier to trim any uneven pieces. Now, my yarn right here is actually pretty good as far as not being kinked, but as I smooth out the rest of my fringe here, still making sure that my edge of the scarf is pretty straight, as you can see, I've got a few little ends here that are significantly longer than some of the others. So I'm just going to very carefully trim off just the very ends of some of the ones that look especially long. And there may be a few that are a tiny bit shorter, and that's okay, because this is not like an exact science. You just want it to look approximately straight. And of course, when the scarf is worn, all of this fringe is not going to be laying perfectly smooth on a table. It's going to be swishing around and flowing around, and as the wearer is moving, it is going to move. So you're just going for an approximate straight trim across the end of all your fringe. So I'm going to go ahead and do this across the other end of my scarf as well. Alright, so I've got the fringe on both ends of my scarf trimmed, and now my scarf is finished. But of course, this would not be a complete how to knit a beginner scarf video if I didn't show how to knit an infinity scarf, which is very similar to making a regular scarf, but we're going to sew the ends together. So I have another scarf that I've already knit. It's not quite as long as this one, and we're not going to add fringe to it. But let's go ahead and look at how we would turn a scarf into an infinity scarf. Alright, so I have knit this other scarf that's a little bit wider and not quite as long. Of course, the exact length and width is up to you, but you would want to do approximately 22 to 24 inches of length in your scarf per time you want it to wrap around the neck, like if you're doing an infinity scarf. So this is going to be our infinity scarf, and you can see that we have done the same add a new skein technique here. So here is our hardly visible joining row where we doubled the yarn and we kind of overlapped the two. So now I can go ahead and trim the yarn tail for both ends of the join. This end just has a little tail sticking out, and I can trim both of those. So to finish this off, I can lay my scarf out here. It is still folded in half. So I've got it folded in half so that the ends are together. We're not twisting this or anything. You can twist your piece before you sew it together if you want to. I'm not going to do that in this particular example. So I have one shorter tail and one longer tail from my bind off edge here. And I'm going to thread this longer tail through the eye of a yarn needle or blunt tapestry needle. Now I like these metal tapestry needles with the bent tip, but that's just my personal preference. And I'm actually going to flip this around so that the end with the tail is actually closest to me. So basically all we're going to do here is we're going to whip stitch these two ends of the scarf together. So I'm going to bring my needle over here to the very corner of the scarf on the one side and back through this side, pull it all the way through, and then again into the next stitch on the bind off edge, next stitch on the cast on edge. And you don't need to take like a ton of bulk in each stitch from each edge, but I like to take 2 strands from each edge. That's my personal preference. And if you take the same 2 strands from each stitch every time, then when you finish off your seam, it's going to look very neat and clean. Is this seam going to be totally invisible? No, not quite, but compared to the rest of the fabric, since this fabric has a lot of texture to it with the garter stitch, and since the texture of garter stitch runs the same direction as our seam, it's going to blend in pretty well. So it's not going to be like a noticeable, obvious thing that you have a seam in your scarf here. So I am going to continue to stitch this together all the way to the other end of my seam, and then we will tie off and weave in the yarn tails. Alright, so I am almost down to the very, very edge of my piece here, and I'm going to go ahead and take one last stitch through both corners, and now I've joined these two edges together all the way to the end. So I'm going to go ahead and take one last stitch, again through both corners in the exact same spot that I just did, wrap the yarn around my needle, and when I pull the needle through, then that is going to make a knot to secure the end of that seam. So this seam is now secure, and all that's left to do is weave in the yarn tails. Now my favorite way to weave in yarn tails when there is a seam right next to them is to weave them into the seam. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And since one tail was kind of on the front and the other on the back, I'm going to go ahead and bring both of them to the back. And now I'm going to cut them both kind of to the same length because they're plenty long enough. And then I can go ahead and thread them both through my needle at the same time and weave them both in at the same time. Now this does make it a little trickier to pull things through, but I'm just going to go ahead along that seam and pick up the whip stitches, which are these little diagonal lengths of yarn going across, and then pull those yarn tails through. And like I said, it is a little tighter to pull them when you have two at once, especially since that very first stitch is a little tight to pull something through. And you do have to make sure that they pull through evenly. You can see how that one of them did not pull through as evenly as the other. But I only need to do this for about 6 to 8 inches or so. 6 inches is like the minimum that I am comfortable with. I would definitely recommend weaving in your tails for at least 6 inches. And I'm going to continue to do that until I am happy with how long my woven in section of tail is. I'm going to go just a little bit further. And what I would like to do, because I'm working with two tails at the same time, I'm going to go ahead and bring both of them through. Give my seam a little stretch there to smooth it out. And then you can either trim one, like I'm going to do. You can trim both of them right now if you want. I'm going to trim one and pull it out of the yarn needle, and then I'm going to weave in the other tail just a little bit further before I trim it, so that if you do see that little tiny fuzzy end sticking out, which is very unlikely, then you'll only see one in one spot and the other will be in a slightly different spot. So again, stretch the seam so that that yarn tail is not pulling on the seam any, and then we can trim it. So that is our finished infinity scarf. And yes, it does have a seam in it, but when you're wearing this, like I said, the garter stitch already has a pretty neat texture to it here that runs the same direction as the seam. So there you have it. We have two completed scarves here, one as an infinity scarf version and one as a regular scarf with fringe, but both with the very basic knit stitch and very little other skill needed. So go grab some yarn, pick which version of this scarf that you want to make, and get started making your very own knitted scarf. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. If you make one of these projects, let me know how it turns out for you in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, making sure you click the little bell next to the subscribe button to be notified of new videos. Thanks for watching.